Hello and welcome back to my channel. So today we are here for a good old casual chit-chatty book haul. Now I had kind of hoped to have a slightly more in-depth video up this week. I have written out all of my research for a video essay specifically on an ancient woman, a potentially quite controversial ancient women. Feel free to put your guesses in the comments down below, but I have been pretty run down over the past week and a half, so I haven't really been up to filming, and tomorrow I'm actually off on holiday with my partner, so I don't have a lot of time to film and edit, and video essays obviously take a lot longer to film and edit, so I'm gonna save that for after my holiday once I'm refreshed, once I am restored, once I'm relaxed, and then hopefully we'll all enjoy the experience a little bit more. But in the meantime I do have some new books in my home and I thought it would be nice to share them with you, as well as some of the new bookshops I might have bought them in. We've had some exciting updates to the bookshop scene in Edinburgh and I've also read a few of them, so I can let you know my thoughts so far on the books I've recently hauled. Spoiler alert, I've loved every single one I've read so far, so definitely some recommendations in this video too. But yeah, without further ado, let's just take a look at the books, shall we? So I finished 2 of the books in this book haul and I'm currently reading another 2 of them, so I'll start with the 2 that I've already read and finished. And the first one is Asa, the Girl Who Turned Into a Pair of Chopsticks by Natsuko Imamura, and this is also translated, and it's translated from the Japanese by Lucy North. I immediately picked this up based on the cover. I was in Argonaut Books in Edinburgh with Jill and Chris and spotted this and was immediately drawn to that cover, that bright shade of pink, the leaf with the googly eyes. I think it's a really well designed cover. And then I also noticed that it had an afterword by Sayaka Murata, who is an author I've already read and really enjoyed, so I was, you know, the book was ticking the boxes, shall we say. I then read the description and thought, yep, I need this in my life. It's actually 3 stories, so it's basically a short story collection. It's actually 3 stories, so it's basically a collection of short stories, 3 specifically, all of which start off kind of ordinary. They start off with young women or girls who are either a little bit dissatisfied with life, don't necessarily fit in, are feeling that uncomfortable form of girlhood that I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with, not quite sure about their surroundings and those around them and what their place is and all of it and what they want, maybe even erring on the side of depression. And from there each story sort of unravels and descends and becomes more and more surreal. I mean, the title is The Girl Who Turned Into a Pair of Chopsticks, and you can take that literally. This is a very literal collection. So basically what it's doing is taking something very identifiable, something very relatable in the experiences and inner struggles of these female protagonists, and taking it to its extremes with these very surreal kind of metaphors to explore that experience, and it's really, really well done. I think the first one, The Girl Who Turned Into a Pair of Chopsticks, is my favourite, I think. Although all 3 of them were really, really spectacular. All in all, I thought it was really clever, really well written, and I'm now really excited to hopefully read more by this author, which is translated into English in the future, so yeah, fingers crossed. Talking about surreal and especially dark literature, I then read The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim. Now this is actually the Illumicrate Evernight exclusive edition, so I'm subscribed to the Evernight box from Illumicrate, which is their horror subscription service, and it's every 3 months rather than every month, which I really enjoy. I think it's a good level of receiving a new horror book, and I adore this cover. I do really like the standard UK cover as well, but this is just something else, so I do want to show it off briefly. Sprayed edges with the creepy eyes, the artwork on the inside. There's a beautiful image on the other side. Hang on, I'm just gonna unfold this whole thing. Look at that, beautiful and creepy, and then the dust jacket. Terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And I love this book. I have been very much enjoying my horror, and in particular kind of my dark literary fiction of late, and my creepy short story collections. Those have been the genres I've been really drawn to, and I really, really enjoyed this book. It is basically a book about the experiences of women, and particularly Asian women and women of colour in the West, the fetishization of them, the crossover between sexism and racism, and it is so well done. It's one of those stories which has a main character who does some concerning things, and what I also enjoy is that it's one of those stories that doesn't need to idealise its central character, that doesn't have to have this sort of like angelic like victim at its centre, which some horror, especially in the past, can err towards. It is about a woman, like I said, who does some pretty disturbing things in her own right, and kind of how that is a manifestation of this oppression and discrimination that she has to deal with. Specifically, we're following our protagonist, who is a young university student. She's in her early days of college, maybe her first year actually, I don't know if it's specifically specified, but she's in the early days of college, and her father has just recently left her mother, which has left her mother sort of anchorless and disrupted their family life. Her and her sister and her mother are now living by themselves until her mother gets a new boyfriend who is definitely not an endearing sort by any means. And life just seems to be messier and messier by the day for our protagonist and her family, and that, like I said, manifests in some pretty dark and disturbing ways. I don't know if I want to say anything more than that, but it was really well done. I think it was a really good use of the horror genre and a good example of why I really like the horror genre. I think it can actually be a really effective genre to explore very serious issues, and I really enjoyed it. I'd probably describe it as feminist horror, and I would recommend checking it out. Then, like I mentioned, I've actually started a couple of books in this book haul but not finished them, and the next one that I've just started is Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt. So I only started this last night, I'm only 30 pages into it, but I am really enjoying it so far. And it was one I actually saw recommended on TikTok first. TikTok has been fantastic recently for like the dark feminist horror fiction recommendations recently. I don't know if that's just like my feed catering to me, or there has just been an uptick in books published in that genre, or people reading that genre recently. I have no idea, but I'm enjoying it and I'm enjoying the recommendations I've been getting. So this one is about a trans woman who, about a year prior to the events of this novel, spent the night in a abandoned haunted house with two of her friends, and it's a year later, something clearly terrible, horrible, awful, traumatic happened. This night, I'm not aware yet of what that is, and it doesn't say on the blurb, but I believe it's all about to be brought back up when she is reconnected with one of those friends who she's not spoken to since. Their friendship ended that day, and they are perhaps forced to confront something about what happened the year before again. I'm not entirely sure because I'm only 30 pages in, but so far I'm really enjoying it. I'm finding the prose very visceral, the imagery very disturbing in a very effective, enjoyable way. Enjoyment is always an odd word to use with horror, and I have no doubt this one is going to creep under my skin, crawl into my brain, and really stick with me. It particularly describes itself in the opening by the author in like a sort of foreword as a sort of anti-fascist horror, or a horror that explores fascism and transphobia in our modern world. So I'm really looking forward to the further exploration of those themes in this book, but so far so good. Then we have one of my most anticipated releases of the year, and that is Myths of China by Xiaobing Wang and illustrated by Katie Ponder. So you might recognise the layout or cover of this book because it is part of the series published by DK and illustrated by Katie Ponder that I have also contributed to. So you've probably seen me talk about them before, but I have 3 books in the series, one on Greek myths, one on Egyptian myths, and one on women of mythology from around the world. And this is the latest installment in that series, which is obviously about Myths of China, and I've already jumped straight into this one. The day I bought it, I started reading it and like flicking through it, and that's what I like about these books. Like, you can read it back to back, cover to cover if you want, but you can also just like pick it up and read a story, put it down, learn a little bit about the gods and goddesses, etc, etc. It is middle grade if you're not familiar with these books, but I personally, and not just as a writer of them, also as a reader of them because I enjoyed Norse myths as well, believe that you can read them at all ages, and think this is such a wonderful addition to the series. There's so many stories in here, a few of which I already knew, but so many of which I wasn't familiar with, or at least wasn't familiar with in depth, and I'm learning so much about ancient Chinese gods and goddesses, and I'm enjoying stories I've never read before, and I just can't wait to keep going. The illustrations, as always, are beautiful. Katie is a phenomenal artist. She really brings myths and legends to life with her artwork, and the writing and selection of myths and information included are also fantastic. So yeah, such a great addition to the series. So happy to have it on my bookcase, picked up as soon as it came out, and I can't wait to read more. So that brings me to the books I haven't read or started yet, but I'm obviously super excited to. And the next two I picked up in Edinburgh's newest bookshop, which is Book Lovers Bookshop. So if you're not chronically online like me, you might not know that Edinburgh has recently become home to the first brick and mortar romance bookshop in the UK, and it is owned and run by Caden Armstrong, who's also a romance author in her own right and a friend of mine, and I have been so excited for this bookshop since I first heard Caden's plans for it, and it's been a long time in the making, and I'm so happy it's here now. I went the day it opened. I made a little TikTok about it if you want to see what it's like inside, and it did not disappoint. Like, Caden has poured so much love and heart and soul and time and passion into this bookshop, and it's so exciting that it's here in Edinburgh. I got into romance a few years ago, and I found it really fascinating to see how little romance is really stocked in brick and mortar bookshops here in the UK specifically. It feels, in contrast with the US, where it feels like there's a lot more stocked in the bookshops, and there are romance bookshops by themselves. And over the years that's changed a little bit. Like, you've started to get a little bit more romance in the bookshops, but it's still a sort of underrepresented genre given how much is published and how much it sells. Like, it's a big genre that a lot of people read, yet there can be a bit of snobbery around it, right? So you don't necessarily see it in as many bookshops to the degree that it exists out there. And then within that, there's a lot of self-published romance, which is harder to find in bookstores in general, when that's like the case for all self-published work. So Caden has created this space where you have romance in every single genre. You have it for different age ranges, including teens and adults. You have graphic novels, a little bit of non-fiction. You have sports drama, you have sports romances, contemporary romances, romantasy, dark romances, historical romances, etc, etc. And within that, she has an amazing selection of queer romances as well. It's a very, very queer inclusive shop, and I loved it. I'm so happy it's in Edinburgh. I'm so happy I'm going to get to visit it regularly. I'm so excited to see this venture flourish, and you should definitely check it out if you're in Edinburgh ever. And obviously on opening day I had to buy a couple of books. So these are books that I actually already had my eye on and immediately like grabbed them from the shelves when I saw them. The first one is The Truth According to Ember by Danica Nava, and I believe, I've come to understand online, that this is the first ever traditionally published contemporary romance novel written by an Indigenous American person. So that is obviously really incredible. It's unfortunate that it's taken this long, but it's awesome that it's happened. But it's about Ember, who's been struggling to find work, so ends up basically pretending to be white in order to get a job, and once in this job she ends up meeting another native guy who she develops feelings for, but they're working together, and also she's pretended she's white. So it's a book about not just like romance and finding love, but also about identity and racism and the contemporary struggles of Native Americans. I do feel like in any book haul you become a bit repetitive, right? Because you just sit there going, I'm excited to read this, I thought this looked good, I'm excited to read this. Obviously I'm excited to read them all, but I can't help it, I probably will continue to repeat myself. I then picked up a romantasy, or a fantasy romance, and that is The Honey Witch by Sydney J. Shields. Now this is about a young witch who is offered up the opportunity to be trained as the new Honey Witch, and it definitely sounds like kind of cozy domestic magic, which I really like. And unfortunately, however, her family and those that have taken up this position as Honey Witch in the past have been cursed never to be able to find true love, which is definitely a trope that you've seen in other kind of like fantasy romance in the past. I can think a little bit of a film that a few of us might enjoy, but this sounds like it's going to be quite like a warm, fuzzy, comforting romantasy read, and our protagonist is both learning to be the Honey Witch whilst also figuring out if maybe this other woman that she meets could be the end of that curse. Maybe she could find true love. So it's also sapphic, which is awesome, and I'm really excited to read it. Then we have a book I picked up on the basis of the author because I recently read another book by them that I adored, and that is Mr. Fortune's Maggot by Sylvia Townsend Warner. So I recently read Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner. I waxed lyrical about it. It was in my favourite books of the first half of the year. One of my favourite classics of all time officially now. Yeah, it's also been in my favourite classics video. It's been in a few videos recently, but I adored it. I thought it was phenomenal. It was from the 1920s about a woman who sort of up and left her life in London to become a witch in the countryside. And since I read that, I've been really excited to read more by Sylvia Townsend Warner because I really liked her writing style and the atmosphere that she created in that book. So I, on a whim, decided to pick this one up next, and I didn't know much about it. I just saw it in the bookshop and thought it sounded interesting, so I will read you the blurb. The Reverend Timothy Fortune, ex-clerk of the Hornsey branch of Lloyd's Bank, has found his vocation: to convert the inhabitants of the remote tropical island of Fanua to Christianity. Even when everyone except for a young boy called Llewellyn remains indifferent to his preaching, Mr. Fortune's good spirits cannot be dampened until one day his faith is put to a terrible test. I have literally no idea where this book is going to go, but I think that is part of the charm of Sylvia Townsend Warner's writing. It could go anywhere. Then we have The God and the Gumiho by Sophie Kim. This is a fantasy novel that I was interested in anyway. I think the cover is very appealing. I was like, oh, what's this? It sounds interesting. And then I read the back, not the blurb, but the recommendations and quotes from other authors. We had The Perfect Drama, according to Chloe Gong, but particularly what caught my eye was One of a Kind from Juliette Marillier. So, if you don't know, Juliette Marillier is my favourite fantasy author. She's one of my favourite authors of all time. I love her fantasy books. They're typically set in a sort of medieval setting. My favourite series by her are set in medieval Ireland, and they're beautiful and lyrical and emotional, and I love them so much. However, she's not a name I see very often in relation to modern releases. Like, I haven't seen according to Juliette Marillier, loved by Juliette Marillier on a lot of books, if any. So when I saw that Juliette Marillier had blurbed this, had said that it was one of a kind, I was sold. It no longer mattered what the book was about because my favourite fantasy author liked it. So yeah, that was the big selling factor for me, but it does also sound interesting, so let's read the blurb together. Kim Hani, the once terrible Gumiho known as the Scarlet Fox, spends her days working at a cafe and trying not to let a certain customer irk her. Seokga, a trickster god thrown from the heavens for his attempt at a coup, spends his day hunting demons and irking a particular Gumiho. When a demon of darkness escapes the underworld and the Scarlet Fox emerges from hiding before quickly vanishing, Seokga is offered a chance at redemption. Kill them both and his sins will be forgiven. But Hani is prepared to do anything to prevent Seokga from bringing her to justice. Anything, that is, except fall in love. Oh, I love it. It just sounds so good. I'm so excited. It sounds like it's also going to be quite charming and humorous, as well as like fun adventure fantasy romance, so looking forward to it. From the Works, I picked myself up a little bargain. I spotted this in the book section of the Works for, I think it was £2.50, and I'd actually previously seen it in a bookshop and thought that sounded interesting. So, you know, when you see something you previously thought was interesting for under £3 or whatever it was, you've got no choice, you've got to take that home. And that is Death of a Bookseller by Alice Slater. And this sounds like a dark thriller-esque novel, obviously centred around a bookshop. Although I don't know if it's going to be a sort of traditional thriller or a slightly more literary kind of surreal, in the head of the character thriller where you don't quite know what's happening. Specifically, it's about Roach, who's a bookseller. And she's a bit of a loner. She doesn't have any friends. She spends most of her time reading true crime, listening to podcasts, etc, etc. Until the day that everything changes. A new bookseller joins their team at the bookshop and everyone loves her. She's amazing. She smells great. She is just wonderful to be around, except that Roach just feels like there's something not quite right about her. There's something dark beneath the surface. And from there I'll have to see what happens. I don't know if it's going to be the kind of book though where all of that is a slight form of paranoia. Is there actually something terrible about this person? Is she actually going to do anything wrong? What's going to happen at the midway point of this book? What is going to keep me turning the pages? I don't know, and I'm really excited to find out. Then we have, I think, one of my favourite cover releases this year. This is A Magical Girl Retires by Park Seo-yeon, and it's translated by Anton Hurst. It's our translated novel, and I love this cover, but if you take off the dust jacket you actually get a full glimpse of the artwork on the front cover, and it's just phenomenal. It's obviously inspired by the concept of sort of magical girl in anime, so if you think of like Cardcaptor Sakura and Sailor Moon, a lot of the manga and anime characters I really enjoyed growing up actually. However, it appears to be taking a more everyday approach to that. So this is about somebody who decides to become a magical girl, but that doesn't necessarily mean wielding magical wands and magical cards and going out there and fighting monsters. It's kind of about what she can do as an everyday person in the world to help others, and I don't know how that's going to manifest itself, but I really enjoy that concept, and I'm really looking forward to see how it is sort of written and how that works and how surreal and magical it is versus how sort of mundane and everyday it is. I think it's going to be interesting to see how all of that is balanced. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this as well. Then I was sent some books by publishers recently, so I will talk about those next. The first one is actually a non-fiction book, and that is Moneta, A History of Ancient Rome in 12 Coins by Gareth Harney. The title's pretty self-explanatory, right? Do I need to say any more? Okay, I'll talk a little bit about it. So I'm actually really excited to read this one because when I was in university, we did study coins a lot. Coins are something that comes up a lot when you're studying history, but particularly ancient history. You know, it can teach you about the economy, it can teach you about trade and relationships between different places when you see money that's sort of travelled across the world and where it's ended up. It can teach you about the status of different people. It can teach you about what cultures valued. It can also teach you about politics through propaganda and say how emperors and empresses were depicted on coinage and what that meant and what sort of vision of themselves they were trying to present to their people, and it is a really fascinating source of information. I don't think I fully appreciated that at university. Like, I understood that. I don't think I necessarily enjoyed studying it. It wasn't like my favourite thing to study. I always thought, coins. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, you know, like when I was 21 I thought, coins, boring, and I have since come to appreciate them a little bit more. Like, I'm definitely a lot less hard and fast about what I necessarily like or don't like or think is interesting or don't think is interesting now than I was when I was 20. So I think it would be really nice to actually return to the subject of coins with just like that more chilled out attitude. And it might just be because like when you're at university you're learning a lot, you're looking at a lot of different stuff, and you kind of just have to draw lines for yourself. You can't love it all, so you're like, okay, I had one dry lecture about coins, I'm done with coins now. So I'm looking forward to just like kind of dipping my toes back into it to a certain extent. It's something that, you know, I've continued to encounter throughout my like research, but it's not something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. Certainly not Roman coins, since I'm much more of a Greek specialist, and I'm just, yeah, looking forward to learning basically, because like I said, you can learn a lot from coins. Oh, and that book was sent to me by Bodley Head. I then have two books that were sent to me by Orbit, one of my favourite fantasy book publishers, and both of which are new out fantasy books with really interesting premises, and both with a sort of like kind of dark villain protagonist sort of at their centre. Like, it feels like they're both exploring the idea of villains as protagonists, which I think is really fun. I've not read as much fantasy like that, and I'm looking forward to reading more, and it's exciting to see that there's more coming out. Now, the first one is Mistress of Lies by K.M. Enright, and this is about a woman in a fantasy world who is a blood magician. She is the daughter of a disgraced blood magician, and she spent her life honing her craft, and I think she's very much motivated by revenge and power in this book. Then we have a second perspective, which is a man named Samuel who isn't interested in magic, who's basically ended up pulled into this dark magical world by the discovery of the victim of a serial killer, and these two characters' lives, I imagine, intertwine. They end up set on a similar path. I don't know how their relationship's going to manifest, what they're going to find, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, if everyone sits more in the range of in between the two of those things. I don't know, but I'm intrigued by the concept. Then we have another one of my favourite covers, I think, this year, and that is Long Live Evil. I love the typography on this cover. I don't know why, it just really does it for me. And this is by Sarah Rees Brennan. And this one's a little bit different because this one's about Ray, who actually is given the opportunity to live in and enter her favourite fantasy world. So her favourite fantasy book series, she is given the chance, I don't know how, to become a part of that series. Literally, to be transported into that magical world. But when she gets there, she discovers that she's the villain. And what's interesting about this one is I've actually seen a few different manga series that take that approach, where we get protagonists, female protagonists, who end up the villains in fantasy worlds, particularly in games, in like fantasy game series. They end up part of these worlds that they've come to love, but they end up being the villain in it. And I wonder if that in part inspired this book. I don't really know, to be honest, but I think it's a really fun concept, and I like the idea of like a chunky novel exploring that idea. Then last but not least, we have a book I did not buy, but my mum did pass on to me, so I thought I would include it here, and that is The English Revolution of 1640 by Christopher Hill. So my mum was recently doing some clearing out, she's doing some decorating, and she was moving some things about, including some of my dad's old books, and she came across this little pamphlet, so thought it sounded interesting. It's a period in history she has always really enjoyed reading about, and then she ended up enjoying it so much that she picked up a full-length work by the same historian that was also my dad's bookcases, and she said it was just a really engaging, sort of accessible introduction to this specific historical period, but that also provided some context to then go on and learn more. And I have to say, I don't think my 17th century historical knowledge is in any way as rich as my knowledge of other historical periods. So I thought, yeah, okay, I'll take that book too and I'll read it, and then maybe I'll end up reading the full-length work by this historian. But I trust my mum's recommendation when it comes to any book, let alone non-fiction in particular. And I believe that Christopher Hill was quite a revered and admired Marxist historian, so I'm sure he'll lend a really interesting perspective to this historical period. So yeah, just thought I would include it in this little haul because it is new to my home. But those are all the books that I have recently brought into my home. A little bit of a range here, from like children's books to adult books, from non-fiction to fiction and everything in between. I'd love to hear if you've read any of these and what you thought of them, or even if there's just any of these are on your TBRs, and if you're in Edinburgh or going to Edinburgh, do you plan on checking out book lovers, you know, because I'm just here basically to promote book lovers. I love it so much. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.